The book of Leviticus tells the story of an ancient people and their quest for communion with the divine. This quest was not unique to the Hebrew people. It was and is the continued question of every generation before and since. How to get to, how to access that great mystery with which we can't quite explain. Leviticus gives modern readers a glimpse into the way the ancient Hebrew people made sense of this. There's a structure to the book that's easily, especially for us Western readers, to overlook. In the Hebrew tradition, Leviticus is actually called Vayikra, which is basically the first word of the book, meaning to call. So that's how often in the Hebrew tradition they would name a book or a scroll would be by the first major or important word. So Vayikra, to call. It starts with Vayikra el Moshe vadaber Adonai, and the Lord called to Moses. Vayikra, or Leviticus, is actually the third of the 5 books of Torah. The first 5 books of Hebrew scriptures places it like right in the center of Torah. The way the Hebrew literature is organized matters. It isn't just some random collection of writings, but it's this carefully organized ensemble of literature that's designed in such a way to convey meaning, not just in its words, but also in its structure. We often place the climax of a story or narrative at the end, with the build coming throughout, or sometimes the main point is at the beginning and we use subsequent information as support. But the Hebrew writers, they build a story a little bit differently. They orient the entire scope around a central event or occasion or point or message. So Leviticus is right in the middle of what is called a chiasm, which is the entire Torah is a chiasm, which makes it the climax or the pinnacle of Torah. So if it's so important, what does it even mean? In the ancient world, there were certain ways that people groups related to the gods. Well, it sounds barbaric to us, like sometimes these practices like sacrifice of living things was just kind of the way people worshipped in the ancient world. Animals, crops, and in some people groups, it was even humans. So how do we read this ancient writing today when we're so separated from its cultural context? Well, we read it just like that, in its cultural context. While Leviticus falls at the center of the Torah, it also consists of a series of movements that make up its own chiasm. This idea that the outer parts of the book or scroll surround this central point, and this central point of Leviticus is actually chapter 16. It's basically all about atonement, or that's actually just 3 words mashed up together, at one-ment with God. Vayikra, it's the call to the Hebrew people from their God to be one with the Lord again, to be united with the Lord. In a culture where everyone thought God was far off, to be united with or to have access to God was to be different from the people around them, just as God is different from the gods around them. But how? Simply following some arbitrary rules of this domineering deity? No, it was to be holy as God is holy, to be different, to be set apart as God is holy. As we look at the sections surrounding this central theme of at one-ment, they'll show us what it meant that at that time and in that culture to be holy. So there's 7 movements of the book. Looking at the chiasm of Leviticus, the outer 2 have to do with rituals, such as sacrifices in the first 7 chapters or holy days in the last 5 chapters. This highlights like how the Israelites are to worship and to keep sacred time. Moving into the next layer of the chiasm, the focus is on the priesthood and the ordination of the priests and the gravity with which they're to take their orders, even like unto death. For example, in chapter 10, 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, don't follow these and they end up facing dire consequences. This can often cause people to wonder how this God that they've been taught is loving and kind and good can do such a horrific thing. But what we have to remember when we're reading this is that this is the way these ancient people were making sense of God in the world and in their own time and place. So this priesthood motif is then mirrored once again in chapters 21 through 22, which it completes this next layer of the structure of the chiasm. And then the final movements, those centered closest around the central theme, are that of purity codes. Chapters 11 through 15 talk about the purity of foods and animals and bodily fluids and diseases, which is then mirrored by chapters 17 through 21, which discusses moral purity and treatment of others and the call to holiness. So the way these are different is 11 through 15, the early part of this section is talking about just basic uncleanness. It's not really talking about sin. It's not talking about moral impurity. It's not talking about like wrongness. It's just impurity. It's just things. We all know it. We know a little thing or two about quarantine, right? So it's kind of that thought. It's just unclean or impure, not necessarily morally wrong, But then 17 through 20 does discuss some moral issues about moral purity, treatment of others, and this call to holiness. And then all of this is leading to that final center section, which is chapter 16. And this is the Day of Atonement, at one mint, right? Or in the Hebrew tradition, Yom Kippur. There are two things that happen on this day according to the text. It actually takes us back to what we were talking about, these weird rituals about animals and slaughtering. But what is different here is that there are two things happening. 2 goats are offered in this particular instance. One is, as usual, slaughtered as an offering or sacrifice. But there's another goat here, a second goat. You ever heard the expression scapegoat? Well, this is this second goat. So Aaron, the priest, Moses' brother, takes his hands and he symbolically and ritually lays all the sins of the community. So anything in that past year, this is a once a year thing, anything in that whole year that has happened, whether it be intentional, non-intentional, individual, communal, priests, regular everyday people, it's taking this and putting it all, anything that has been missed, all onto this one goat, onto this scapegoat. But this time, instead of slaughtering it, he sends it away into the wilderness. He sends someone off to take it into the wilderness, bearing on itself all of the sins, all the iniquities, all of the uncleanness of the community. It goes off into a barren region, and then the goat is set free into the wilderness, Bamidbar, which we'll learn about in Numbers next, but it's sent off into the wilderness. But this goat is never slaughtered. It's just sent away. How often we misunderstand the meaning behind all of this because we don't have context. How often we think guilt requires some sort of payment when even in this archaic portrayal, it was sent away to be forgotten. You see, our modern evangelical context, we often read archaic stories like this and misunderstand them to be barbaric or inhumane. For example, we read the instructions for slaughtering animals and think it's awful. And I won't pretend to argue that that is right or good, but then we're forced to ask ourselves the question of how our society treats the very same kinds of animals. How are cattle raised and slaughtered now? Do we even know? We just go to the store, we buy a pack of burger or some chicken, and we're none the wiser of where it came from. In Leviticus, there is this sacredness to life and death and blood. We don't pay attention to what we consume. We lose sight of the sacred nature of death and of life. What if what we see here is actually a call, vayikra, to be different? What if the call is to treat animals and the world and each other differently than the culture around us? What if we cease work and consumption for one day a week? What if we're mindful to only eat meat that's been humanely raised and slaughtered, or none at all? What if instead of paying off deities or assuming God requires blood sacrifice or to get access to the divine, we look around and we see that God is already all around? You see, the Israelites, like all the other people groups around them, thought they needed a tent or a tabernacle. So as the story goes, God showed up and met them in the way they could understand. But in doing so, God required that they behave differently. What if we today hear this call and behave differently than the world around us? What if we are different because we see God differently? What if God isn't the kind of God who requires a tent or a sanctuary or blood or a building? What if God was always right here, but humanity just couldn't see? Until one day, God showed up and embodied what at one meant actually meant all along. What if God was always present on mountains and in valleys and gardens, but was always still willing to keep showing up even when we misunderstand or require some ritual or structure to alleviate our own guilt and shame? What if God merely wants to send it away and forget about it instead of asking for a sacrifice? Vayikra el Moshe vadaber Adonai, and the Lord called to Moses. And the Lord calls to us, from the tent, from the mountain, from the garden, from the church, from within. Adam ki yakriv mekem, if any of you brings or comes near. See, Leviticus begins with a call, vayikra, to come near, kariv, and ends with an invitation to rest, Shabbat. Can you hear the echo in the words of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew? Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you